I tried keeping spoilers in this video to a minimum, but I realised that in order to do this topic justice, I needed to go into the details of all of these games. As I bring them up, I will display a clear timestamp to avoid a game's spoilers. About a year ago, I played through Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. For all of its faults, it manages to be interesting, divisive, and narratively confident. But there was one thing above all that really coloured my experience. It was an early game message which comes up just after your first combat encounter. It says, "The dark rot will grow each time you fail. If the rot reaches Senua's head, her quest is over, and all progress will be lost." So, high-strung on the fear of permadeath, I powered through the game, managed to avoid dying too much for the progress lost to happen, got to the credits, and moved on with my life. But just a few months later, I came across a discussion of Hellblade online where it was mentioned that the permadeath message was a straight-up, bold-faced lie. And I bet there's a good chance that a lot of people watching this just discovered that it was a lie as well. Honestly, I was floored by this. I had no idea the entire time I was playing, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about how no other game has made me feel so unabashedly lied to before. My whole retrospective view on Hellblade has changed, in some ways for the better, and in some ways that are much harder to label. But no doubt it was effective. So is straight up deception like this going too far? Well, firstly, I want to answer this question just for Hellblade. The game is essentially divided into environmental puzzle solving and combat encounters. When you, as Senua, die in combat, a black rot grows up her arm and you reset as if the death was just a hallucination, but with the progress of the rot growth still remaining. Eventually, it can crawl up to her shoulder, her neck, and finally her head. What makes this a bluff though, is that depending on what chapter of the game you're in, there's a threshold above which the rot will not continue to grow, regardless of how many times you die. But to keep stakes high, there are also key moments in the story where the rot will grow anyway, outside of your control, so you're always feeling the pressure of imminent permadeath, even if you don't die in combat at all. The story of the game follows Senua, who suffers from psychosis and is on a journey to bring the severed head of her dead lover Dillion to the Norse god of the underworld in order to save his soul from the depths of Helheim. Whenever people talk about the permadeath mechanic in Hellblade, as long as they're not complaining about it, they'll say that the pressure and stress supplied by the guise of losing your save file mirrors the narrative around Senua, whose psychosis means she suffers from severe anxiety and a detachment from reality. And it's all true. The lie the game serves you makes you play far more conservatively, as the tension runs high every time you face an enemy. The minimalistic approach to combat design is in perfect harmony with its lie too, since it allows you to play slowly and methodically, easily exchanging risk for time if you choose. Not only that, but a genuine symptom of psychosis happens to be the ambient but unfounded feeling of imminent death. I can't speak to this myself, but this is a part of the rationality behind adding the live permadeath to the game, as according to the creative director, Tame Antoniades, and his personal experience talking to those with psychosis. He has said, quote, "I was speaking to one fellow who described it as a fear of death. This was one person, I don't want to generalize everyone, but in this particular case, during psychosis episodes, there was a palpable fear that he was going to die. So, that's what we wanted to try and find an analogue for in the game." End quote. The choice to deceive the player is very deliberate and has a very specific intention behind it. But all of this stuff has been discussed by plenty of other people, and I think the reason for the lie in this game to be as brazen as it is goes even deeper, and is missed in a lot of even the more detailed discussions around Hellblade. So, let me try and explain. A core novelty of the game is also the voices which haunt Senua's mind. They whisper in your ear throughout the journey, especially effective if you have headphones on while playing. These voices, though, are unreliable. Some of them support and help Senua, while some insult her and encourage her to make mistakes.
Wait, you must have been. You're stupid. You're stupid.
So Senua can never trust what she's told. And the one time that information is given directly and explicitly to the player through text, it is also a lie, making you unable to trust what you're told either. It gives the lie a thematic strength. It's more than just mechanical, it's an integral part of the storytelling. But this can go even a step further. While the player can recognize Senua's psychosis, from her perspective, she is cursed by an evil spirit manifesting as the Furies which speak to her from within her mind. Her backstory gets revealed gradually and non-linearly throughout the game through visions of an old druid. She grew up with a mother who also seemingly suffered from the same psychological symptoms, but she accepted it openly, not as a curse, but as a gift. Senua's father disagreed though, seeing it as a burden of evil, and eventually burnt Senua's mother alive in front of her when she was a child. The trauma twisted Senua's perception of her psychosis into the curse she sees it as throughout the present moment of the game's story. As Senua got older, she escaped her father's abuse to live with Dillion, who she fell in love with. But then, as luck would have it, their village was overrun with disease, and of course, Senua blamed herself for it because of her self-perceived curse, leading her to exile herself. When she returned to the village much later, raiders had killed the village survivors, including Dillion. Senua sees this as her fault too, and self-imposes a duty to save Dillion's soul from Helheim, which requires taking his head to the god of the underworld, Hela. When looking at it like this, every hardship Senua meets on her journey, every struggle, every failure is self-imposed, manifested by the trauma and the misunderstanding surrounding her symptoms of psychosis. In the ending of the game, Senua gives up on her quest, realizing Hela was simply a reflection of herself in her mind. But it was because she was empowered by the understanding that she's owed no guilt over Dillion's death, and she accepts her condition as part of herself like any other, not a corruption of evil. In other words, she rejects the lie that she and her father imposed upon her. Now, if we return to the meta lie that the game tells the player, it's directly tied to the visual feedback of the black rot growing up Senua's body. Given that the curse Senua sees within herself is always described throughout Hellblade as a darkness and is presented as the rot itself, it kinda feels natural that the growing rot wiping our save file also turns out to be a deception. Both the player and Senua interpret the rot as something it isn't. It's there to intimately represent a serious perspective to the player on psychosis and mental illness more broadly. That guilt and self-loathing is often a result of the traumas and social stigmas caused by psychological symptoms. They're not strictly inherent to the symptoms themselves. It's a fine line to walk to try and say that a video game deceiving you about permadeath is anything like the self-hatred and harrowing depression that can come with mental illness. It runs the risk of trivializing the gravity of the topic. What makes the comparison in Hellblade avoid coming off as crass is that in all other facets of the game, the way mental illness is handled is with empathy and genuine seriousness, which makes it easier to take the metaphorical elements of the rot in good faith. Never does Hellblade become so heavy-handed as to imply that the fear of dying in a game is comparable to psychosis-fueled paranoia. But what it does do is leverage the interactive nature of games as a medium as one of several ways to help meaningfully underline its messages about mental illness. The idea here was clearly to evoke a feeling, not replicate one, and it doesn't need to. I mean, could you imagine? Having said all that, this comes from the perspective of someone without a lived experience of psychosis or severe mental illness, so take that for what you will. So yes, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to looking at why this game lied so eagerly, but there exists a completely different conversation we could have about the game. The fact that, technically, this might not be a lie at all. A double lie, maybe. If we return to that interview with Antoniades, he actually has more to say about how misleading that lie actually is, or isn't. Quote, "The wording for the permadeath message was chosen quite carefully because we didn't want to lie to the player. It's actually your interpretation of the message that is what threw people off. End quote. And okay, this is technically true. Let's look closely at the early game text again. The first part says, "The dark rot will grow each time you fail." Now, when you die, the rot does in fact grow, though only to a certain point depending on your progress through the game, so sure, technically true, or half true at least. The second part says, "If the rot reaches Senua's head, her quest is over and all progress will be lost." Now, the final moment of the game is having Senua give up in the last combat encounter, where the rot really does reach her head. However, this is scripted. When it does reach her head though, this is the moment Senua realizes that she doesn't need to torture herself with the guilt of her partner's death, in turn giving up on her quest to save his soul, which was futile anyway, as the ending makes clear. So again, yes, technically true, but where the word technically is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, like a fuck ton of it. Honestly, it's to the point that I don't really buy that this can still be interpreted as anything but a lie. It's like when I write, "I speak French" on my resume, even though I haven't spoken it for almost a decade and I'd probably struggle holding a conversation. It's a deliberate lie, not by fabrication, but by ambiguity. There's no real way to deny accountability here, despite Antoniades' claim that it's the player's perspective who's responsible for interpreting it as a lie. No. The wording is deliberately phrased to be interpreted incorrectly, regardless of the player's experience. But it's worth unpacking the nature of this lie, because it puts it into a certain category. Similar to lying by omission, lying by ambiguity doesn't feel quite as bad as just fabricating straight bullshit, but it's still deception nevertheless. So, does it go too far in its deception? By answering this, we can start to find exactly where that limit is more generally. Now, sure, the lie in Hellblade has a purpose. It's effective in how it reframes the player's perspective on the game's mechanics and thus their emotional state, and is part of the intended experience, and it sits neatly within the themes of the game. So there you go, it's all fine. But there is also a counter-argument to this. Hellblade's deceptive little message was endlessly controversial around its release. You had people saying that, lie or not, playing through a game of this style with the fear of permadeath looming over was unfair and ruined the experience. The word anti-consumer circulated around this discussion, which is wild to me, but whatever. A slightly more measured take I've seen are from people disappointed that they played the game on an easier difficulty than they otherwise would have, where they might have had a better combat experience if they didn't change their behaviour around the permadeath illusion. Or, there are people who just simply dropped the game because they knew they wouldn't have fun worrying about death the whole time. Which is maybe kind of the point? But anyway, to some degree, I feel like a lot of the outrage came from the frustration of being duped. I mean, it's not exactly a nice feeling to realise that you were being tricked and you weren't clued in enough to figure it out. No one likes being lied to without their knowledge. From reading reviews and discussions on the game, a common approach people seemed to have was to see the permadeath message, Google how the mechanic worked to make sure that they weren't going to lose their progress too easily, realise it was a lie, and then get generally frustrated at the game, at the devs, and at the whole premise of the lie itself. The problem here is a game intersecting with an audience it's not really designed for, and that is not an indictment for either side, by the way. Hellblade does try to strike a moderate balance between approachable and provoking, but it's still fairly experimental, at least compared to other AA-sized games. It's not a chill walking simulator like some might have thought, nor is it a run-of-the-mill combat-focused third-person action-adventure game. Maybe its marketing was unfairly generic? I don't really know, but if it was designed to be just an entertainment product in the same way a Hot Wheels car is, then yeah, the lie is probably unnecessarily brazen. But the deception achieved its creative intent, for better or worse, and as something trying to communicate a complex feeling, that deception is easily warranted. We can poke at this by asking whether it would have been better to have just committed to the permadeath mechanic in full. Well, for one, it would weaken the thematic link to the lies Senua tells herself. So then, let's just look at it mechanically. If you legitimately lost a full 8-hour run of the game because you died one too many times, the game would become unbearably frustrating. Enough people complain about simply the idea of losing your progress in this game, I can't possibly imagine what people would say if it actually happened to them. So really, I don't see any upsides to telling the unambiguous truth in this case. And if the lie was removed completely, the game would lose one of its most interesting elements. That's not to say that finding out it was a lie months after I'd finished it and put it out of my mind didn't affect how I looked back on it. It's a breaking of the fourth wall, which, in retrospect, reframes the whole game experience as one within which you are under a fundamental misinterpretation the entire time, much like Senua was. But it's also hard to shake a slightly dirty feeling of having been deceived. I mean, does knowing how a magic trick works after the fact undervalue the performance as a whole? Well, like most rhetorical questions posed like they're trying to be deeper than they actually are, the answer is, it depends. Regardless, whatever I discover after the magic trick, it doesn't change how I felt about it in the moment. So, was it a perfect design decision? Maybe not. You can read this Polygon article which criticizes Hellblade for trivializing mental illness by gamifying psychosis and just generally lacking nuance. You can also read like 1,000 YouTube comments of people pissed off that they were either tricked by the studio into buying a game with permadeath, or tricked by the game into thinking it had permadeath. Both perspectives which probably don't bring you any closer to empathizing with mental illness like the designers intended. But for every voice lambasting the game, there's another who wants to thank the work put into helping an underrepresented demographic in this medium feel more seen. And many of those voices are people who have psychosis or a related mental illness themselves. So, maybe the question shouldn't be, was it a perfect design decision, but instead, did it help communicate a struggle which often goes unheard? I'd argue that it does, and crucially, it's by lying to the player that the game manages to pull them into a space where its message is felt, not merely observed. If we want to understand the effectiveness and limits of lies in video games, Hellblade is a little bit messy, because within its lie, it's hard to separate out the mechanical and thematic consequences. So let's look at a slightly different type of lie. That is, lying strictly about mechanics and game systems. Do it well, and a lie about a mechanic can enhance its effectiveness. If it seems pointless though, it could have the exact opposite effect. This is something I noticed in A Plague Tale Requiem. One of my main criticisms about the gameplay in Requiem was about the skill progression system, and I'm still not entirely sure why they handled it the way that they did. We can first understand how the progression system came to be in Requiem by looking at the previous game in the duology, A Plague Tale Innocence. Innocence was a game very modest in scope, but heavily inspired by cinematic action-adventure games. Think The Last of Us. It looked fantastic, especially at the time, but it was extremely linear, fairly short, and its stealth combat mechanics were as simple as it could honestly have gotten away with. The main weapon was a sling, which you could take out enemies with using headshots, and there was a simple range of ammo type variation which could allow you to distract enemies or put them to sleep. Nothing too complicated. So, the main gameplay loop was really just finding a safe position and aiming at enemies' heads one by one until they were all gone. Dynamic, it was not. Yet, it still had plenty of heart, and it was successful enough to warrant a sequel. So the natural approach was to take what worked in the first game and build it up to be bigger and more impressive. The core philosophy of the updated combat system was then one with a lot more freedom of choice in how you approach encounters. Now, you can set things on fire as a distraction or as a trap. You can use hit and run tactics much more effectively in the large open combat arenas. Crossbow bolts act like dynamic environmental elements. And a wider range of slingshot ammo types means that combat is far more tactical, where both full-on aggression or stealthing from the shadows were both equally valid options. Then, of course, there's a new skill system, which provides 3 different branches of skill upgrades to make the combat and stealth feel more configurable as a function of playtime. To top it off, seemingly, it's also there to reward particular playstyles, since you can't choose which skills you get directly, and instead the game tells you that you'll either get a stealth, an aggressive, or an alchemy skill based on your approach to each combat encounter. It's a style used by plenty of action games to reward the execution of deliberate playstyles, like Skyrim's activity-based skill progression. For Requiem, in the game's own words, Amicia will automatically increase the mastery of her 3 types of skills depending on your approach style and the tools you use. Press trapezium to close the menu. But this is it. This is the baffling lie of A Plague Tale Requiem, because as I was bashing my head against a wall, trying to level up my stealth, but only getting upgrades in the other 2 branches, I discovered that each skill gets upgraded depending not by what approach you use, or by how you decide to take enemies out, but on simply how many of them you manage to take out per combat encounter. There's even a Reddit thread detailing, for every single encounter in the game, what the threshold is for defeated enemies to get into each of the 3 skill upgrades. Maybe you could swing number of enemies killed as an approach style, but the system absolutely does not take into account the tools you use, despite what the game tells you. And this kinda threw me. Why does the game say this to you? Why not just actually tell the player that the skills depend on how much ghosting versus killing you do? Well, I can't know exactly, but my pet theory is that Asobo Studios originally wanted the system to behave how they suggest it does, but there weren't enough time and resources to pull off a system which intelligently tracked a diverse range of playstyles while feeling natural, and so the final method was the shortcut. But what was left in is simply a bad lie. While I can concede that it might have benefited my playthrough in some areas, for example by highlighting the range and approaches I had, and by encouraging me to use a toolset I might have otherwise not, the lie ultimately caused more frustration and confusion than it was worth. And it only became worse as the game went on. Early on you don't really think about it, but once you start targeting certain upgrade trees, the lie becomes gradually more evident. But it's more of this weird dissociation from the system than anything specific. You can try taking out lots of enemies with your alchemy, but kill too many and you'll get the aggressive skill perk. Or you can go in sling blazing, but rush past a lot of enemies and end up getting stealth perks. All it does in the end is confuse me. Really, the very fact it makes you think reflexively about the system in the first place is its biggest sin. And if you do eventually discover that it only considers number of kills per encounter, it kinda feels like a slap in the face for putting in any effort to sticking to certain playstyles to begin with. There's a pretty cool America's Got Talent bit, where a magician pulls off an inexplicable illusion in front of the live audience by making coins and rose petals appear and disappear by simply waving his hand above them. Not an uncommon trick, but the seamlessness is particularly impressive, maybe even too impressive. And if you want, you can actually see it broken down, and it turns out that it's not much more than a bunch of VFX composite shots. Thanks, Captain Disillusion. Now, yes, it's still very impressive initially, but when it feels off-kilter, you start thinking consciously about how the trick was done. And if you come across the answer, it only feels cheap in retrospect in a way that a purely physical illusion doesn't. Just like that magic trick, the strangely blatant lie behind Requiem's skill upgrade system comes off as pretty annoying once you know how it works. There's a line it feels like is being crossed. Similar to a magic trick, there's an unwritten contract that a player has to accept on the game's terms in order to enjoy it and get the intended experience. But there's also a limit to how deceptive a game can be before acceptance turns into the feeling that the limits of that contract have been betrayed. Sure, I could accept that the skill system is based on the number of kills instead, but after having been told it was a much deeper system, it suddenly feels half as interesting and a tenth as satisfying. The limits of this contract were pushed a bit in Hellblade, since the lie was so overt, which is why some people took issue with it at launch. What that game has going for it in its favour though, that Requiem does not, is that the payoff for the lie is far deeper and more interesting. And with Hellblade's casual handling of the truth, it goes to show that lying about mechanics is not necessarily for the worse. When well executed, much like good sound design, you're extremely unlikely to even notice anything out of the ordinary is going on. A lot of action and combat-focused games sneak in small white lies about their systems or UI to improve the user experience in some way. A quick honourable mention goes to dynamic difficulties. Resident Evil 4, for example, will change enemy numbers and ammo drops depending on how well you handle its encounters, all on the same difficulty selection. It's a lie by omission, not communicated to the player, that can keep the pace of the game balanced without disrupting immersion by having the player fuss around with difficulty settings. Another example of a payoff worth the deceit. Though I know many people who at least want an option to turn this off for consistency's sake, but then we're talking about configurability. A more robust example can be seen if we take a stroll through the desolate streets of planet Serra. Gears of War came out around the time that invisible health bars were becoming the standard in action shooters. You know, where instead of a depleted health bar, the screen put on a black and white colour filter, or a red colour filter. For whatever reason, colour filters were health bars now. Gears of War, however, has a slightly different approach to the indirect health bar situation. Instead, it uses a small UI element to make your health status a little clearer than just smearing tomato sauce all over the screen. A red cog appears in the center of your view, which becomes more opaque and filled in the more damage you take. Then, once you've really screwed the pooch and you're at your last dregs of health, the cog becomes completely colored in and an audio cue sounds to let you know that you're on your last legs. When you're in this state, the UI is indicating that you can't take much more damage, but here's the kicker. At the same time, that last bit of critical health is more resistant to damage than the rest of your health. So, the game lies about how close to death you are so that you're more likely to clutch out of a seemingly hopeless situation, feeling like you came out on top against the odds. It turns a position you probably got into due to a mistake into a success story, pulling the player through combat encounters with a much more elegant pace. And because of how subtle the lie is, and how much more satisfying combat becomes under the illusion of more "that was close" moments, you will almost certainly not even notice this UI lie. This effect is used in plenty of action games to make you feel like a badass as much as possible. To pull another example from the same game, but this time its multiplayer component, Gears developers noticed that 90% of players who didn't get a kill in their first multiplayer match went on to never play it again. So Epic Games needed a solution. If you were in your first ever multiplayer match, you actually had a damage bonus against other players, which tapered off with the first few kills. Maybe it intrudes a little bit on the fair and competitive spirit, but it's a fairly innocent intrusion, which by and large allowed newer players to enjoy the multiplayer experience significantly more, unknowingly giving them a taste of what it would be like if they stuck around and developed their competitive skills a bit. Some games take the non-linear health system even further though. Guilty Gear Strive is one of the most active fighting games within the fighting game community at the moment, and guess what? It lies about its health system too. It's a fairly typical 2D one-on-one fighting game, but with a vast set of nuanced systems to give a high skill ceiling, a frenetic pace, and to make each character feel really unique without giving everyone 1,000 unique combos and special moves. Anyway, one of these systems is called the Guts system. Every character in Guilty Gear Strive has something called a Guts rating, which ranges from 0 to 5. Now, if you're not familiar with fighting games, most of them have what's known as damage scaling, which is where moves will do reduced damage depending on the circumstance, typically as a function of a combo length. This prevents one player from getting absolutely bodied by a single lengthy combo. Well, Guilty Gear Strive also has combo damage scaling, but in addition, its Guts system is basically a global damage scaling multiplier, where the larger the Guts level, the stronger the scaling. It helps the characters feel unique, but more importantly, for all Guts levels, the scaling gets more aggressive the lower the health of the person taking damage. For example, if Kai is hit with a 100 damage move at full life, he will take 100 damage. Makes sense. But if he's got barely any health, say less than 10%, he will only take 50 damage from the same base 100 damage attack. What this means is that the health indicated visually by the health bar is, you know it, a fabrication, a fake fictitious falsity that makes things seem more dire than they actually are. And what happens is a higher chance of clutch comebacks that put you on the edge of your seat, making playing and spectating artificially more exciting.
There's no way. No, there's no way.
He's gonna do it. He's gonna do it.
No way. No way.
High five. Get your currency from that.
And the game barely hides the lie. Knowing the numbers is crucial if you want to be competitive, so you can just look up the Guts rating of any character you want. But no one cares, because even if you know what's going on, the lie makes things far more exciting. One of the most well-known traditional magic tricks is the cup and balls. It's used to entertain and impress, and it's also used to swindle people out of their money. But Penn and Teller have a unique take on the cup and balls, where they use transparent cups. What happens is a performance made entertaining not by its illusory nature, but instead by the sheer display of skill. If anything, knowing how the trick is done makes it even more impressive in hindsight. It enhances the trick. A perfect lie, then, is one where its discovery feels interesting, rather than like a cheap parlor trick, and one where, much like Gears of War's health system and Guilty Gear's guts mechanic, a player will be too drawn into the moment to think reflexively about the systems operating above them, even if the lie is known. A bad mechanical lie, on the other hand, can put a player in a different mindset, incompatible with the construction of the game itself. In A Plague Tale Requiem, it promises choice-based progression but delivers a kill-based metric, and trust is broken between player and system, forcing them out of the immersion. Had it just been upfront with its mechanics, like Skyrim's one-to-one action-to-skill progression, it would feel a lot more natural and much less annoying. In gaming, as in all art, it's not the lie itself that matters, but the care and purpose behind it that determines whether it resonates or whether it pushes you away. What's a video game lie that really boils people's blood? The ones that insult more than any other. Well, it's probably what I like to call the Todd Howard lie, which is a lie about the actual scope and feature set of a game within its marketing. This type of lie takes place entirely outside of the game itself, yet can have serious consequences for how a game is perceived. The easiest example to point to is No Man's Sky, for instance. But this isn't particularly relevant to my focus if I want to answer the question of when is it that a video game lie goes too far. We're getting a little bit meta once we start talking about video game marketing culture. But there's a similar kind of lie which often makes its way into the actual games themselves. Take the dialogue choice adventure game genre. They often make a statement in the beginning of the game, like the one in Telltale's The Walking Dead, which says, "This game series adapts to the choices you make." That the story is tailored by how you play. I mean, every second dialogue choice in a Telltale game is saying something like, "Clementine will remember that," which, in the context of an interactive story, pretty unambiguously implies that your choice will have an impact down the line. Now, either way, there is some necessity to this kind of statement. The player needs to know that there are at least some consequences. You certainly don't want someone to underestimate the impact of their decisions. However, often, i.e. basically always, these statements imply a much greater degree of impact from the player than truly exists. And the rigid endings that most of these games have lead to frustration for a lot of people, since the expectations about a heavily influenceable story simply aren't met. Of course, there are some games where a smorgasbord of endings do exist, Detroit Become Human probably being the best example. And Until Dawn's insistence that anyone can die at pretty much any point if you fuck up is usually delivered upon. But the vast majority of games in this genre let you make seemingly massive critical choices, but where all options produce identical outcomes. In The Walking Dead Season 1, late in the story, a scripted scene has Lee's arm getting bitten by a zombie. The player has a choice to either leave it as it is, or cut it off in the hopes of preventing the spread of the infection. It feels like an incredibly high-stakes choice, and it's probably the most pressure you'll ever feel playing the game. But regardless of what you choose, the same thing happens. If you don't have Lee cut off his arm, he of course turns. But if you do, it turns out it was too late anyway, and it had already spread to the rest of his body. The same gut-wrenching ending plays out in both cases. But if you didn't already know the parallel outcomes of the two choices, you might never know what little impact they had. That isn't so true in Life is Strange. While it has its own opening text prompt, which tells you to choose wisely, the ending of the game is completely linear until you get to a fork in the road. Regardless of which of the thousands of combinations of choices you've made throughout the game, the player selects one of two choices to determine which of two ending cutscenes play out. It doesn't even pretend that your choices through the rest of the game have any bearing on the ending. It's cut and dry to anyone that most of the choices you made were false choices, an illusion of choice, and none of them affected the ultimate outcome of the story. Games are fundamentally lying to you by their very nature. They're simulations of a reality, and in order to get the intended experience of the whole, you need to sign the unwritten contract. But of course, there is a limit to how deceptive a game can be before someone feels like they've been unfairly duped. Discovering a game lied about essentially being a better version of what it actually is tends towards the limits of breaking this contract. When looking back over all the choices that had thought and effort put into them by the player, which ultimately didn't mean anything for the outcome of the story, it feels a bit cheaper in retrospect in these choice-based story games. Which, by the way, is there a better name for this genre? Everyone seems to call it something different. Anyway, if Life is Strange were more upfront to the player with its scope, it might have made it easier for some people to accept the format of its ending. It falls into the same bucket as the likes of Mass Effect 3 or Deus Ex Human Revolution, where the ending is a cutscene chosen by pressing one of 2 or 3 buttons. But what makes Mass Effect, and in some ways Life is Strange, feel potentially insulting rather than just uncreative, is that throughout the runtime of these games, they hand you what seems like dozens of critical choices, where very noticeably none of them play into their endings. They wear their lie on their sleeve by presenting the ultimate outcome of the game as one completely divorced from the choose wisely doctrine set up by their presentation. A lot of people will ask something to the effect of, do choices only mean something when they actually have consequences? But I think a more interesting question is whether the choice still has the same meaning if you think there are consequences despite the fact there are none. You know, if a tree falls in the woods and all that. I mean, if you played through The Walking Dead Season 1 and you never knew that almost all of the choices were just an illusion of choice, is it really an issue? The claim that this game is tailored by the choices you make may not be so untrue depending on how you interpret the word tailored. The branching paths in these games are not just about making the choices feel weighty in the moment out of the fear that the wrong decision will have negative consequences, but sometimes the choice system simply builds a stronger connection between you and the characters in the narrative in a way that serves the story being told, even if those branching paths join up soon after. In The Walking Dead, even if your choice to have Lee cut off his arm or not has no lasting consequences, you still have to contend with why you chose one option over the other, a decision you carry with you until the ending of the game. In Life is Strange, one of the heaviest decisions you have to make is in an alternate timeline where Chloe is paralyzed and completely lacks independence of any kind. Chloe asks you to help her end her life. No matter how you slice it, this isn't an easy choice. But by the very construction of the plot, there are no consequences for this decision. It's an alternate timeline, yet it remains one of the game's most emotionally tense moments. However, it's still all under a broad proposition that choices matter because of their consequences, not only what they're able to evoke emotionally. If you accept that the game is less about replayability in the outcomes of your decisions, and view the choice mechanic as a method of heightened engagement for an explicit core story being told, and it's much easier to see the utility of the mechanic. Accepting the lie that choices have consequences thus allows this kind of game design to work. It's also why, though, the implementation in Life is Strange can seem as though it falters somewhat. It often brings too much attention to its illusion of choice. And quick note, I do read Life is Strange as a story about the futility of trying to change a predetermined universe, but that doesn't change the disappointment that often comes with not living up to the promise of choose wisely. A perfect solution might be to have a multitude of high-quality, thematically consistent, and highly configurable plots, all with a well-paced act structure. But at that point, there's literally n times the writing work required for however many stories could be told, and that's ignoring the additional development work. All to make a set of stories only one of which most players will ever see. It's a logistic problem solved by a bit of white lying, using illusion of choice instead. In this genre, as long as the world and characters are engaging, a player will tend to put in effort to making reasoned choices. It's why like 90% of players choose the good options when presented with a morality meter, even when the bad options might have mechanical benefits, like in Spider-Man Web of Shadows. It's not just about balancing a spreadsheet. People like narrative choices in games because it gets them to connect with the story on a more personal level. And as long as the illusion of choice is not so brazenly surface level, players will happily go along with a game's terms to enjoy a purpose-designed and cohesive experience. So where is the line when lying about video game scope? Well, if you're Todd Howard, it's already too late. But within the games themselves, it's about using the unknown breadth of its mechanical systems without it being too easy to peek through the curtain. So yeah, there are a lot of ways a game can lie. Clearly, they can lie about the scope of their narrative mechanics. But lies can be told within the framework of a narrative itself, a technique used to help shape a story in many mediums. There is, for example, the unreliable narrator, where the trustworthiness of an authoritative voice can deliberately deceive you about certain plot elements, like in The Beginner's Guide or the Stanley Parable. There's also the classic plot twist, where the way a story is told leads you to a false prediction. But in not being particular to games as a medium, they're not really my focus here either, but still make an interesting discussion on their own. More relevant is what happens when the interactive nature of games is leveraged to deceive a player. There's a nuanced kind of lie that occurs when the expected result communicated by the game of a choice or mechanical input has an unexpected outcome. This can be played for a joke, or when it's unintentional, it's just bad game design. But it can also be used to help tell a story. Hellblade fits this category, for example. Its big lie is mechanical in nature, giving a different outcome than what is implied by its feedback. And by telling this lie, it of course pushes its storytelling forward. There's a much bigger instance I'll get to soon, but first, I want to talk about a lighter example in Deus Ex Human Revolution. It might have a shit ending, but that doesn't mean it doesn't do anything interesting. Around the mid-game, an objective comes up to tell you that you can optionally install an upgrade chip. It appears in the UI and is overlaid on the map as an objective like any other. Get the upgrade chip and you'll receive an inconsequential amount of XP points and move on likely without ever thinking about it again. The chip comes with 0 advantages, other than the XP for clearing an objective. The kicker is that, in fact, it does less than nothing. If you decide to do what the objective tells you and grab the upgrade, one of the late game boss fights is able to shut down your augments during the fight, making it significantly harder. Where completing any other objective gets you intrinsic mechanical and narrative rewards by progressing through the main and side objectives, the language of UI lies to you to suggest you pick up this mechanical penalty for seemingly no reason. So what is the actual reason? Well, like Hellblade, it's to support the game's storytelling. In one way, it rewards the player for listening to minor exposition in cutscenes and for reading and listening to the text and audio logs littered around the world, which hint at the true nature of the upgrade chip. In another way, it represents the consequence for the laissez-faire attitude towards opting into corporate-controlled augmentations for your body. Human Revolution doesn't really have a lot to say explicitly about its subject matter, but this is one little nugget you could choose to read into a bit. Given, however, that the player can connect the dots before being misdirected, this leans more towards a case of misleading the player rather than outright deceit. It's a pretty tame example, all things considered. But a game which takes this concept to an entirely different level is one of those big ones, a real thinky kind of game. I am now going to do the thing and talk about Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops is one of the most famous games that misleads the player about the consequences of their actions. Full spoilers, by the way. The whole game's foundational narrative concept is that the main character is being lied to, or is simply just wrong about, the circumstances behind his escalating military mission in Dubai, in a story deconstructing the use of violence in action-heavy and war-set games of the time, commentary that is still relevant today. The game opens on 3 bona fide US military capital D dudes. They all fit some kind of badass military shooter archetype, and the first few chapters play mostly like any standard military shooter of the era. There's the stock standard cover mechanics, the dual weapon slots, some standard grenade types, one-shot headshots, basic sniping mechanics, and the buzz-cut male lead with Nolan North's recognizably bravado vocal cords.
Multiple tracks headed north.
Then we follow him.
There's nothing to really indicate that this game is any different from the smear of brown dusty oorah McShooter games which were just past their peak in 2012. But the longer you play the game, the more it starts to seem that it's not quite doing the same thing as everything else. Evocative murals around the environment start raising the question of whether you're helping the right people. And then, without much fuss, the enemies change from generic foreign insurgents to exclusively US military forces, and you're shooting your own people down. And it only ramps up from there. It lures you down a comfortable garden path that twists and turns into a subversive deconstruction of the genre. It all comes to a head about halfway through the game, because of course, no one can talk about Spec Ops without discussing the white phosphorus scene. And in terms of how the game lies to the player, this is where it makes its ultimate move. Captain Walker and his 2 squad members reach an enemy camp and can't move forward without being clearly outnumbered in a gunfight. But in a seemingly fortunate stroke of luck, an armed drone and a laptop are just sitting right there next to them. One squad mate, Lugo, pushes back against the idea of using it. It contains white phosphorus, a devastating incendiary weapon of which they've all witnessed the torturous effects. He says, "There's always a choice." And Walker pauses before saying,
No, there's really not.
Then you take control of Walker again. This interaction, and the liminal moment of time you control Walker for, seems to imply that there might be some choice to this part of the game, but that the suggested action is to use the white phosphorus, given that cutscene Walker has nodded in that direction. But the only way to progress is to use the weapon, and very crucially, once Walker spreads the white phosphorus across the camp, he, and the player, soon realize that this was all not what it appeared. No. The whole time, this had been a military station manned to protect a populated civilian camp, and Walker had just obliterated a shelter full of innocent people, leading to the most poignant and aggressively discussed imagery in the game. It's a gotcha moment, meant to make the player really start to question the rationality of just accepting whatever it is the game tells you to do. In this way, the scene represents a lot of things. It's a commentary on player choice, and a criticism of the trivialization of violence in games media. But this one particular moment in this one particular game has been explored many times by professional writers and YouTube essayists alike, so I'll refer you to them if you want to hear more about the broader discussion. For now. But that's not really the point here. I'm interested in the lie. What Spec Ops is doing is giving you this unavoidable choice. Regardless of what your gut reaction is to using the white phosphorus, you're railroaded into a war crime. The lie, though, really comes from leveraging player conditioning. The exchange generally goes like this. I follow the game's instructions, and in turn, the game gratifies me for doing so. The player is a customer, violence is the commodity, so let's have a bit of fun with it. But Spec Ops says no to that whole premise. By assuming that you're conditioned to receiving gratification for crossing off the next listed bullet point objective, witnessing the devastating outcome of the white phosphorus scene takes you by the shoulders and asserts that you question what just happened. What was your motive? Why keep doing what the game says? Why does the game choose to do this? Falling for the bait is what allows this framing to work. Zoom out and the game keeps lying. Some scenes in Spec Ops begin by a fade to black. Pretty standard. But some curiously fade to white. For example, a fade to white precedes the scene where Walker finds a walkie-talkie with Conrad, the seeming cause of the tensions in Dubai, on the other side. Conrad then immediately forces Walker, and thus the player, to choose between executing a thief who stole water or the overly punitive soldier who murdered the civilian's family for doing so. The stakes are high and the consequences seem dire. but the ending reveals that this was all a hallucination to some degree. The walkie-talkie was missing batteries, and the two men were dead to begin with. The fade to white precedes all of the scenes where Walker is under some kind of delusion. Even the white phosphorus scene has a fade to white transition. This doesn't imply that the sequence of events never happened, too much of the rest of the plot hinges on it. But Walker's interpretation of the event is what's misguided. From his insistence that "we don't have a choice" is a valid reason to absolve himself of responsibility, to his shifting of blame to Conrad, a man who doesn't exist. You could also use it to explain why the group of refugees on the IR drone camera used to drop the white phosphorus all have the character models of the soldiers, backpacks and all. Yet another lie directed towards the player. Maybe. I'm admittedly assuming this part is intentional, but hey, it works. Walt Williams, Spec Ops The Line's writer, is on record supporting the general hallucinatory read of the fade to white moments. This would mean about half of the game presents scenes which have not actually happened one for one outside of the protagonist's head. Walker lies to himself, and in turn the writers lie to the player, a merging of the spaces either side of the fourth wall. However, the regularity with which a misleading sequence of events are presented make them fit together like a puzzle whose pieces don't quite match in shape, all jammed together. Something always feels not quite right. It gives an unsettling feeling to the story, one in which you're not in control, where you're told there's always a choice, but no, there's really not. Not if you play on the game's terms. Zoom out again, even further, and it's all beneath yet another layer of deception. Not only was the opening of the game generic to mask its true intentions, but in a meta way, the marketing of the game was as well, presenting it as a bog-standard affair. Trailers sold the game as just a regular Gears of War COD hybrid anyone could probably enjoy. But, unlike No Man's Sky, this lie was arguably part of the creative intent. That's a pretty big risk to take. The whole purpose of a marketing budget is to get as many eyeballs from your target audience onto your product as possible. And usually, the easiest target audience are the ones who like the same stuff you're offering, and you're just showing them your version of it. What Jaeger and 2K did with Spec Ops was to market to a general audience. Sure, this was a large market, but not necessarily one seeking a genre deconstruction, and functionally gave them something they didn't sign up for. Considering all of this, it went reasonably well. The game sold poorly, but it's hard to say how much of that had to do with its marketing approach. It was generic by design, but that means it played generically. But what's more impressive regardless is that it's still talked about today, and it wouldn't have hit as hard if the box art had given away its secrets. But there's one thing that I've avoided talking about until now, and that is that the game did not hit quite as hard for everyone. There's an air of controversy to Spec Ops. An argument exists that the game gives you no other option but to follow the red herrings and then be scolded for doing so with no alternative option. And this is a valid argument in some sense, since the message loses its effectiveness if you start predicting the lie. The subversive nature of the game is only effective if your attention is misdirected, if you take the bait. Come into the white phosphorus scene knowing that the game's main goal is to be subversive, and the effect is lost, making it easy to feel talked down to. So everything hinges on the ability of the game to succeed in its illusions. And the way the white phosphorus scene is presented has some flaws. You can try to target the last shot of the white phosphorus on the adjacent tank, but no matter how good your aim, it spills over into the densely populated refugee camp. Some say this is kinda the point though, that you can still know what's about to happen and yet you still play the game. And while you might have tried to avoid melting the camp to the ground, the very fact that you followed through anyway is the thing that Spec Ops wants you to reflect on. But then, when all of the emotive imagery is used to condemn walkers, and by extension the player's decision, if you saw through the ruse, you could see yourself as having less of a hand in that choice, and then the condemnation comes off as far more condescending. If the message is rejected, then the indictment of the industry falls flatter. Only if the bait is taken does a natural questioning of one's motives follow. For some, the illusion in Spec Ops is performed with transparent cups, and instead of making the trick impressive, it shatters the illusion necessary for subversion. It's easy to see a flaw as a binary thing though, but it's not. Just because the game's approach to choice was not a perfect solution, that it allowed some to see through its misdirection, doesn't mean it failed by any means. The legacy of Spec Ops is a testament to this, its resonant message still ringing out over a decade later. It just means there's some nuance to how that message was executed and to the variation of its effectiveness. The fact that the game chose to lie, and the magnitude of the lies themselves, are not the main issue. In fact, they're what makes it work at all. But instead, the approach to the framing of some of its choices are what caused some problems. Then, at the game's ending, it reveals all. At this point in the game, we see Conrad's dead body. We see Walker's descent into mad spiraling delusion for what it is. Whether or not you saw through the lies earlier than this no longer matters. Spec Ops has taken you along for its ride. So if we want to know if Spec Ops takes its deception too far, then the answer is no. It takes that unwritten contract between player and game, and instead of trying to find loopholes, it tears it straight down the middle, breaching what is normally considered the threshold for an excessive lie. But come the ending, it's not hiding that fact. It's the entire point. Spec Ops lies and cheats wherever necessary. It's not here to flatter you. It's no surprise that we see lies all around us in the games we play. It's a device built into human nature. People do it all the time to skirt accountability or to protect others' emotions. Some are even pathologically disposed to it. But we don't like being lied to. It tips the balance of power away from our direction. And generally, when we play a video game, we want to be able to exercise our power and not be patronized in the process. So there has to be a good reason when a game does try to deceive us. So where is the line? There's no one rule which can spit out a clear answer. It's just one parameter among many in the complexities of game design. When done poorly though, it's a distraction that detracts from the experience. When a game promises one thing and delivers another, it can retrospectively make a game feel cheap. It can break the illusion of the whole game itself, and sometimes it's just plain confusing. To be successful, a payoff which balances out the lie is needed, and as a result, you'll be too immersed in its effect to notice. This is why Hellblade works. Its lie ties together multiple thematic strands and evokes a rare type of empathy. It's why action gameplay can feel as gratifying as it does, since small measures of deception can create moments of tension. It's how a single focused story can be elevated to something so much more personal through a feeling of constant choice. And it's how interactivity itself was able to make the deconstruction of a genre in Spec Ops: The Line as memorable as it is. In the end, we all line up for a magic trick because we want to be impressed. Deliver on the setup and no one will care that you rigged the deck. And when perfected, the deceit itself becomes a part of the very fabric that makes it remarkable and memorable to begin with. Thank you for hanging around until this illustrious end of video section. I'm active in the comments, and if you have any thoughts about anything I've discussed in the video, I'd love to chat about it. I was trying to find a quick and simple topic to get an easy video out while I've been busy with life recently, but I fell down a couple rabbit holes and this turned out to take quite a bit of time instead. Having said that, the video is far from an exhaustive list of video game lies, so let me know if there's any obvious ones I've missed. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did and want to see more like it, the best way to help out is to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And on that note, I'll see you next time.